identity as a permanent creates the inherent need to associate characteristics and features and quality which are seen as ideal. This is done because there is a necessity to create a moral framework associated with these things, with the pride that is involved in the same. I would explain this further. But more importantly, while associating with these things, given they are permanent, we feel the need to value these things, given they would be part of our life forever. Sometimes define our value by these things, all of which associates a sense of pride to the thing or identity we are associated with. The reason this happens is very simple. There is a community of people who probably are like us and they are proximate to us. This can be people with the same nationality, this can be people with the same gender or the same identity, or probably people who like the same things, same kind of food. All of which means these are people who want to be associated, people who want to feel pride and some form of uniformity in the way they live. But more importantly, states and association would always want to make sure that these people are brought together in order to benefit from them or to create uniformity amongst them for better functioning, which would require some form of glorification of these identity features or the things that they are associated with. Which means even if it doesn't happen internally, we say it would happen internally because you do want to create a sense of pride around things which are with you forever, simply because you want to be proud of them and you want to feel good about them. This is likely to be done by external institutions like states, religion, associations, who probably want to make sure there is uniformity, and uniformity can be created at the point when people are proud of the way they live, or probably they are proud of the things which are in their lives. All of which means that the sense of pride that is associated with either identity or things would force people to live in a uniform manner. At the point that happens, there is a significant need to create a moral code which would associate characteristics and features and qualities that people are supposed to follow. But more importantly, when you have pride towards any particular thing, it also creates the inherent need to defend against any form of deviation. That is, at the point when people are proud of an identity or absolutely anything, it is far more likely that they would not be okay with people deviating from the moral framework that has been created. This happens because the institutions that create moral framework have extraordinary amount of power. This can be institutions like religion, civil society, or states, which very often have the power to control the media you consume and control the education you get, and generally control everything that you know in your life. But these are also institutions that are seen as more legitimate than others. Very often you respect the state, you have pride due to patriotism, you respect the religion because it is enforced by the quality of God, who is seen as all forgiving, all good, and omniscient, all of which gives them more legitimacy, and therefore people are willing to follow it. All of which means that given there is a strong sense of indoctrination into these ideas, it's quite likely that there is a significant need to enforce the things that you are proud of and the moral framework that is associated with them. All of which creates few fundamental problems. At the point when people deviate from the moral framework you create, it is far more likely that they would either be alienated or attacked for it. The reason for this is very simple. They are seen as individuals who are violating moral code of things which are supposed to be permanent and things that we are supposed to be proud of. But more importantly, they are probably going against moral code created by institutions which are legitimate, very often powerful, and bigger than themselves. All of which means that these are people who would feel alienated and attacked. But more importantly, and this is an argument that applies to everyone, the moment at the point when you create a moral code of conduct, you tell people how they should live and what they should do with their identity. Remember, our entire lives, we are likely to be associated to a form of identity or things all around us. At the point when there is a clear code of conduct, it is far more likely that they would try to dictate and micromanage each and every mechanism to create total uniformity. The reason this has to be done is simple. At the point when they are able to create total uniformity, at the point when they are able to micromanage even smallest of conducts, they are able to create large-scale following and lesser deviation. The possibility of deviation creates the possibility of questioning something that you are proud of, which means the simple reason as to why they would want to micromanage your conduct at all levels is to make sure that you have no opportunity to deviate and you cannot even think about deviating. This means that they have the incentive, the institutions which are powerful enough have the clear incentive to create a pathway for their life even before you are born. So at the moment you are born, you are put into structures which you did not necessarily consent to. They can be religion, they can be gender dynamics, or specific things that you probably did not consent to, and you would probably decide otherwise. I want to claim that at all moments, at the point when any form of framework is created for you, probably a broad moral framework is okay that guides you, but at the moment oppressive frameworks are created for you, you are no longer an individual exercising your choice or agency to any extent. You are far more likely to be an individual whose actions are dictated by somebody else. The difference between a human and a chair is very simple. I get to decide what happens to me. A chair doesn't get to decide what happens to it. It is far more likely that we objectify human beings and treat them like chairs, which is probably really bad. I will take CO.
We change the rules of Catholicism. Insofar we can change the religion that has dogma, we can criticize other moral institutions as well. Why you cannot criticize them on both sides of the house?
My problem is not with any form of dogma. Clearly, there is alienation, and that's an argument that I have already made. My bigger problem is dictating how people would live from the moment they are born. This debate is no longer about only religious institutions, but all things that people are associated with. At the point when there is a sense of permanent to most of the things, it's likely that each and every detail of our life is micromanaged to the best extent possible. Our careers, genders, identity, the partner we take, and almost everything else we do, all of which is likely to be influenced by choices that is not necessarily ours. The comparative here is very simple. When things are seen as transient, and don't necessarily look at other parts of Infoslide that says it can change in future. When things have no inherent value to them, there is lesser sense of pride associated. There is no necessary reason for it to be so rigid that people have to defend it. And therefore, stronger institutions have absolutely no incentive to micromanage each and every part of your life. They probably create some guiding frameworks like law to manage people, but not necessarily every part of life that you are associated with. Very proud to propose.
Thank the speaker for the wonderful speech. Happy to call upon the leader of opposition. Here.
Hi, am I audible and visible?
Yes, to both.
Thank you. So I will put my timer on. I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1, now. There are two main clashes in this debate. First, how this affects the institutions that we live as a society, but second of all, how people in an individual way interact with the vast majority of this conception of essentialism. First thing first, I'm going to clear up the clash of how you can be oppressive when you have this essentialism in my side of the house. I'm going to argue why this is worse in government. The first thing is that discrimination and oppression is something that is likely to be symmetrical in both sides of the house. First, because anti-essentialism doesn't mean necessarily that you are going to accept every identity or every type of difference that people have. Notice that, for example, new racism that exists, for example, against the African American community is not like 50 years ago where you were thinking that by nature people were different, but they are saying right now that because of cultural reasons, these people are more violent or these people has less opportunities. The excuses that you can create for oppression are also can be relied in cultural and social reasons in order to discriminate some groups in the first place. But second of all, the second answer here is that I'm going to flip this argument. Note that the essentialisms can be used in a bad way for oppression, but also can be used in a good way for the progressive movements. That is to say that when the feminist movements talk about that there is an intrinsic value of the body of the women that not any culture can trespass or can violate in the first place, is something that has to be respectful in any circumstances, despite the social construction that people lives in. Yeah, the claim over here is that obviously the concept of essentialism can work for good or can work for bad reasons. But in the moment that it's used for a good reason, it has a more stronger ground to sustain from to the future and by time. Why this is the case? Because when you are creating a concept of essentialism that is something that is objective, it's more easy to send this message to other people without having this idea that this is only a feeling of the people of this community. That this community only feels that way. They feel this way, but it's not the objective truth. It's only when you are creating these parameters in inside of the house, when exists an essence, that you can create more moral values to try to create more a stronger identity. But second of all, the second thing that I want to explain in this speech is going to be note now. I'm going to explain why this is going to create more collective actions and why this is going to be good for the people that has any identity. First, I think that essentialism is good because it creates people with a more secure of their identity. Why? Note that identity is very important because it creates a meaning of life. It's a coping mechanisms because it brings me a purpose and also it brings me an idea of what I need to fight for. The problem when you are creating an anti-essentialism is that you're creating a perception that this is something that is changeable in the future. That is a meaning that is meaningless because it depends on other cultures or how people socialize these ideas. They create problems in the security of your own identity because you feel that this identity is something that is random because of social circumstances. But second of all, notice that the problem of anti-essentialism is that when it's contingent to a specific context, people does not have or does not feel that they have a duty for their categories. That is to say that they feel that they don't have a duty for the people that suffers from the same race, or people that not now, or people that are part of the same nation. The problem here is that identity for a collective action is indisposable in order to break the oppression that government was arguing in the first place. The only reason why Latin America community of the African community could be against the imperialism is because they thought of this idea that they have a national identity that wasn't unchangeable and they have to need to fight for. When you are creating an idea that this is something that is a random stuff or a circumstance of the universe, you think that you don't have a duty with your own category. But lastly, when you feel that this is not permanent, the problem here is that you don't have an incentive to fight for these ideas, or you do not have an incentive or bring effort to the vast majority of these values. Why? Because you have this idea that these categories can change in the future when you are having a change of the social backgrounds. So when you are having this risk that the whole identity that you are protecting right now can change in the future because other social circumstances, there are no incentives to bring a lot of effort to this type of stuff. Yeah, bring me the POI, please.
The need for identity and belonging is because people feel like they are too different. That is why they seek those labels. Those are rooted in essentialist ideas like your world. Why do you
I will argue this. The reason why there are differences between, for example, cultures or national identity does not depend in this philosophic idea of essentialism. This is by parameters of power, of trying to exploit other nations. What we are arguing in opening opposition is that in both sides of the house, they are going to create some differences. There are going to be some people that are being oppressed. The difference is that when I'm creating an essentialism philosophy is when people can take a collective action as a group to try to fight the vast majority of this oppression, but also to cooperate with all other people. Note that in my side of the house, there are more reasons to cooperate with people that are part of the same category. For example, people that are part of the same gender or people that are part of the same nation. Why? Because if we think that we all share the same essence, we try to create this association that we are familiar between each other. This creates like, or this is taken down like barriers when I do not know a person. identity and essence permits me to connect with other people despite I don't know them well. This creates more important collective action in the first place, and it's better to the future to try to protect their own interests, but also to create dynamics inside their own category, like their gender or the nation, to feel better about themselves, because they have now something that is an essence that what they can be proud of. For all of that, proud to oppose.
I thank the Leader of Opposition for the wonderful speech and invite the DPM. Here, here.
Audible? Okay.
Yeah, you're good.
The case coming from opposition is that you can just call bad structures out and you can change them by drawing parallel to good structures. Couple of responses on this. First, they never prove why you have access to good structures from which you can draw parallels to, because of which you force like society forwards and make them change norms. Second, why people have the capacity to do this in a good manner. And even if people have the capacity, they try to do this, why there won't be any other forces in society that try to stop you from adopting these like better cultures. No explanation whatsoever. In instance of this, what you're going to get on opening opposition, opening government is quite simple. It's the idea that there are some groups that oftentimes have more power than other groups. These groups have the these groups have the power to set the agenda of what identity is supposed to be, how you're supposed to like fulfill gender norms, what your nationality is supposed to look like, and they oftentimes practice it in a bad manner. Even if it is that you can use these groups to draw parallels from them, opening opposition has a high burden here of proving why this cannot be done through other manners, why this can only be done through drawing these parallels. In absence of that, the harm is a lot more visible. This is the first response. The second is, I think the problem with this argument is that the harm is still inflicted at the end of the day. And note, this harm is already done. So even if in future you can have recursive solutions to this by drawing parallels, it's uncertain as to when this is going to come. The fact that people have to fight for their own freedom and they have to draw parallels and constantly fight for this is a harm in and of itself, because these people oftentimes have to make concessions in order to do this. They have to suffer for change, and this is just principally immoral for the fact that you're forcing smaller groups to which have very few resources to fight against larger groups with a lot more resources and the narrative setting power. What is the impact of people having more agency? And this applies even if it is that people are not exploited by others. I think the idea is simple. The agency is what gives meaning to life. Why do I say this? If I were to tell Anshuman when he's going to shit, at what time of the day, when he's going to go where, and what speech he's going to give when, he would probably not enjoy it at all. The only reason he derives any joy out of debating, out of shitting whenever he wants, is because he can decide it for himself. Nobody has to tell it to him. This allows him to do whatever he wants and whenever he wants. Even if there are some bounds from society that tell him that, well, you cannot shit wherever you want in the world, he can still exercise his agency to a great extent. This agency being inherent to you is what helps you make bad decisions. It is what helps you make good decisions. This agency helps you make good memories and bad memories, which is all necessary for you to feel emotions at the end of the day. So the only thing that is important in this world is for you to have your own agency, because this agency gives meaning to your life. Without this agency, you cannot feel emotions, you cannot feel good about your achievements, you cannot feel good about your losses. None of it matters. Before that, POI, closing.
So the institutions that OG talks about inherently focus on the things anti-essentialism talks about. This means that on their side of the house, it is far easier to prosecute a Black person based on context and random identity than on our side of the house.
No. So that's not necessarily true. By the way, I don't think status quo really applies here, because status quo is obviously a mix of both. This is this house prefers world. So we are talking about where one is a bigger norm than the other. Let's just get into this case. I think Anshuman already proves to you to a great extent why your identity makes you feel superior. It makes you want to stick to this identity and defend it at no matter what cost. What do you do as a consequence of this? You impose this this identity onto other people and onto other groups. There are multiple reasons for it. The first is that you just have the capacity to do so, and a lot of times people are shit, they're absolute assholes, and they feel like they have they're going to change the world, they're going to make the world a better place. Second, if people are good, they feel like there is a moral obligation for them to act in a good manner. Third, there are oftentimes like religious doctrines that are ingrained into you, or like cultural values that are ingrained into you that tell you to help other people, for you to like spread the good word, and for you to like be nice to others. This automatically transfers into you want like imposing your ideas onto others and having this like messiah mechanism with you. I think this is exactly what tells people that it is your human nature to act more benevolent, to like tell people and interfere in situations where you might not even have to interfere. This is the same reasoning that was used by US to invade in South American countries, for it to invade in Middle East, because they just said, oh, well, these countries are being run by dictators. That's not a good form of like democracy. That's not a good form of ruling yourself. These people are having women follow their own religions, which is so bad, because women should have as much autonomy as possible. Note, maybe all of this is true. Maybe you shouldn't have dictatorships. Maybe women should not follow religious doctrines to a great extent, but there is no reasoning to believe why why the US is a better moral superior actor and has to practice this agency and like force other countries to change their norms and like make decisions for themselves. There is no explanation as to why the other actors that are going to coerce you into changing your own cultures and traditions and the way you exercise your agency is going to do this in a good manner. In an absence of this, people absolutely have the capacity to abuse their position, and as long as there are going to be some dominant majority groups which have a lot of agenda setting power, they're likely going to abuse this. This was also the same logic that was used by Western imperialist people when they were invading most of South Asia, because before they came in, gay sex and like being transgender was quite common. It was according to white people who came from Britain that told people that, oh, it's inhumane to have gay sex, that it's only humane to have a relationship between a man and a woman. This is the word that gets strengthened on opposition. The problem here is twofold. The first is that I don't think people have any access to objective truth. I don't think objective truth even exists in the first place, given that we're all born in different cultures, different languages, we have different traditions, and we have different friends as we grow up. If there is no objective truth, for some people, what might be considered, let's say, gender liberalization might be considered moral confusion for other people. Even if this is not the case, even if there is objective truth, there is no reason to believe that you have access to this, given that you're born in your own individual circumstances. Even if that is the case, at best, what opposition does is claim that one case is more morally superior than another case. So the imposition that is done by some majority groups onto other minority groups is something that is done illegitimately, because you don't exercise any objective truth at the end of the day, given that you don't have access to it. And even if you have access to it, they have a higher burden of proving why this will be achieved. The impact of this is quite simple. I think majorities are able to practice narrative setting power recklessly for their own benefits. This might be social, political, or economic. They can set beauty standards by themselves. They can like form correct forms of nationalism, of governance, and what it means to be human. They have the incentive and capacity to obviously ignore the context, given that they primarily care about themselves, and given that there are fewer checks and balances that exist as long as they're the majority and they're oppressing minorities, inflicting their opinion of the world on them.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for the wonderful speech, and to wrap up top half, DLO.
Hello, I'm audible?
Yeah, you're good.
Thank you. And thank you for the organization. It was amazing just to participate in this tournament. And of course, my couple and partner in this debate. So let's start in 3, 2, 1. The problem with all opening government case is that it relies on the oppression, and it means that maybe and probable the oppression it's something that is not happening their side. But as Juan Esteban explained to you, the oppression is something that is symmetrical. Why is that? Because if you have an interest to invade countries, it is based on dynamics of power, of resources, of necessities. It means that this is not relate intrinsically in the essentialism. That is the first thing to say. But second, even the flip about these necessities, it is around of the idea of how I can integrate actually people that are not equal, but have a common sense of something and have an essence to defend it. That means that in my side of the house is when you have states that are actually from different religions, but have the power to defend the nation, and says, and other ones to equal because they respect that type of acknowledgement. They respect that type of values. This is my side of the house. How do you feel that you already have a stronger power values to defend and have a feeling or makes of sense? Notice something, and I'm going to be engaging with these ideas. The most case of governments, it is relied on the idea of my identity is a necessity or agency or some type of freedom of changeability. But I need to just clarify this, because we need to be more characterization about how we build our identities and what we like in order to build our identities. And I think in my side of the house, you have a stronger sense of yourself because you are dealing with values that are not changeable. You are dealing with values that probably can some have a dominance, but it can be more attractable to you because it has an intrinsic idea of how to be. And that means in different ways. For example, if you have the human dignity in my side of the house, and you defend regardless if you are in a part of the world or if you are a criminal or if you mean some bad action, it means that in every aspect of your life, you're going to defend that human dignity because you believe that is something that intrinsically belongs for whatever people that is there, which means that you're defending also your human dignity. You're defending how you're going to be well in your status quo. You are defending how to protect you in most of the cases. That means that the regardless and the comparative way that they are seeing it is, in most of the time, you are just struggling because you don't know what defend in their side of the house. They challenge a lot the intrinsic value of being a human. They challenge a lot the intrinsic value of just have a gender or whatever, and that means, and in most of the cases, that you just have an identity crisis for what is the select that you need to choose or what is the way to go around. What we're saying is that that beliefs, even if there is an imposition for some characteristics of constructions of some context, the essence of belief that there's something that is assumable as universal protects actually the institutions that we are located now. And also the historical and construction of them, it just leads in better values, because we need to be very characterize the comparative, because even if they can argue that there's some bad ways to do this, when this conform in a dominant norm and when this is challenging, for example, or this is having into the main base structures, that means that you need to be able to objectivize more values in a way that is acceptable for more people. That, for example, become institutional, universal institutions that allows people to be there even if they have different backgrounds, even if they have different cultures, even if they have different ideas of how to run the world, even if they are not democracies, whatever it is, they are nations, and they are become part of this world that is universal and is challengeable. What happen in my side of the house, it is likely that you do your terms of cooperation and collaboration and actually understanding of this principle is more likely to happen, because in the intrinsic value you just understand very well in those matters. But the second is that you don't have this aggregation of stuff that it demands that when you are fighting for something, in an example of, for example, your human dignity, there is a regardless of the question that if you do something or if you are not more able to just pursue that dignity, because, for example, you are in a jail in El Salvador and now you are just to perceive as a criminal, and you don't have any other type of currency. So what happened in my side of the house is that advocacy of this can be more general, first, but second, protects better the people for oppressive cultures that exist in the ground, but third, protects the people for inclusively oppressing institutes or states that not allow the people just to be in the universal gap of the side. Yeah, close.
Why do you believe trans women are women?
Oh, and that's, yeah, I think in this in prep, there is an assumption that the government going to say that, trans women are not women because the essence of the woman maybe can be biological, but turns in something different here, and something that it's not regardless of the cultural aspects of the challenge that you did. It is in my side of the house, you still believing that they are women because the essence of the woman is not biological. It is in the essence of different aspects of the life that construct the woman, and that means that it's not something that is in the cultural aspects, which happen in my side of the house. Is the defense is not in a round of ideas of the culture I can change, and now we are accepting. Is it the base of every time they are the women, only that we are not defending them because we are done like the difference of a woman is explicit, eminent. It's been to a woman. So even in my side of the house, there is a challengeable, yes, some type of changes, but the changes are more local and are more, no local, sorry, more universal and pursuing in the terms of more objective ways to defend it, which means that my advocacy is not going to challenge all the time. It is not going just to restrict myself or put me in a worldwide position. Also, you need actually people to fight your fights, right? You need people that you don't know, but has the essence to be part of your own goals and your own values. In my side of the house, that belief is more stronger, which means that the difference is not something that you allocate like a scrutiny or something that is not helping you. What we prove in this debate is three main things. First, the oppression is going to stick symmetric in both sides of the house, but in my side of the house is when this operation can be fight in terms of the universal values and can be fight in a better way. The third is the long term of these measures that is applying for every true human, even in the difference, and that is something that is more solid. But third, the identity is more structural, and it don't create this crisis of identity. Very, very proud to oppose.
I think that's speaker for the wonderful speech, and invite the MG to open up the bottom half here.
Hi, am I audible and visible?
Yes to both.
Cool. If you could do POIs verbally, because I'm not going to be checking the chat. Also, I have a frog in my throat, so sorry about that. You're going to have to bear with me here. I want you to notice that the entirety of the benefits that opposition bench has tried to claim is the current inklings of the rise of anti-establishment that we're seeing in the current status quo. When the previous speaker answers to the POI by saying that, what makes a woman isn't necessarily biological, but that definition has expanded and there's different aspects to it. Yes, this is exactly what an anti-essentialist world is going to look like. These are the notes of anti-essentialism that we are seeing currently in the status quo, and that we, and by their own concession, opposition bench, also want more of. I'm going to do a few things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to clear up what an anti-essentialist world is actually going to look like, because this is step one for this debate to even take place, and no other team has tried to address this. There has been just sort of an implicit understanding. Then I'm going to talk to you about why oppression is necessarily tied to essentialism and how that breaks down under our side of the house through the power of community. Notice that this is especially important because the top half talks about nebulous ways of changing entire political systems ingrained in the way that our world works and societal structures, while neither team proves which one is more likely, the reinforcement of these systems or the taking down of these systems, how the narrative or a label is going to actually affect the worldwide institutions. What we're going to talk to you about as closing government is something much more accessible, much more likely, and much more important. Communities. How even one person feeling better about themselves, firstly, it's good in and of itself, and secondly, is the first step to actually getting the change that governments and that the opening parts try to claim, but then really do the legwork to show. Let's start then with what an anti-essentialist word is actually going to look like. This is important because this is very hard to imagine, right? We live in a very essentialist world right now, so it's very difficult to actually imagine what government wants to stand for. But this is debate, and this is supposed to be fun, so let's play a game of imagination and stay with me here. We think that this is going to look like eventually working towards having a more global identity, things like looser senses of borders, using labels and not seeing them as necessary, the concept of what makes things like a woman or a man or someone non-binary being very malleable and up to the individual, and having no need to indicate things like pronouns, gender, or race when I'm being introduced to someone or when I'm applying to someone, because these are not the things that are viewed as inherently important to the person. Rather, what is viewed as inherently important to the person is things that they think are important to them. So if I'm Greek and I find a lot of importance in that, I'm going to mention it. But if my teammate doesn't find importance in that and she finds more importance in her religion or in her gender or in her, this is what it's going to be like. This is likely to happen through a push in media, through a push through governments, and through a linguistics push. If this is the dominant belief, this means that everything eventually is going to fall into place. Notice that this is incredibly important framing because it is step one for running the marathon that opening teams are trying to run in claiming that they're going to take down sexism or capitalism or whatever. Now, I'm going to go into our own actual extension of how this is likely to reinforce a sense of community for people, because when labels are not fixed, they actually are a lot more accurate. The first thing we're going to explain here is why oppression and separation of community is necessarily tied to the concept of essentialism. One, as opening government already said, because this comes from the dominant definition of the powerful. Two, and more important, is because labels in an essentialist world act as an active divide. Human already biologically have a them versus us mentality, exactly because of the need to protect ourselves in nature from enemies. When we have essentialism with very rigid labels, we are far more likely as human to view someone that doesn't use the same labels as us as someone who is the enemy, who is the them according to the us. Versus we tell you that in a world where labels aren't fixed, it is far more easier to counterbalance this them versus us mentality that humans have. Why is that? This is because people are far more likely to see the similarities between one another. If someone can use the term Greek or democracy in a far more liberal way, this means that I'm far more likely to focus on the similarities that I have with that person, exactly because someone who doesn't look exactly or same very rigid definition as me is also using the same term, so we have something to identify on. And thirdly, because of internalized hate, a lot of people are forced to label themselves as something that they don't necessarily believe. This happens with a lot of straight men that not necessarily, but they feel the pressure to say they're straight because they haven't explored the sexuality. This forcing of label means that people internalize that they're not the person that they're meant to be. This is likely then to lead them to lash out and blame others. This is important then because one, we take down OO's entire premise of, oppression not being down to essentialism. And second, it proves that anti-essentialism actually brings people far more together than it does bring them apart. Before moving on to further analyzing that, I'll take a point.
The problem with the government bench is that they still defend labels, but they want everyone to choose their own label. This creates a liquid conception of these labels and is not transcendental for every individual.
Yes, that is exactly what we're defending. I think it would be pretty cool if whoever feels like a woman can call themselves a woman, if whoever feels like a man can call themselves a man, and who am I to decide that for them? We think that is great. I'm going to go on to talk about what happens to labels with anti-essentialism. First, we look back into history so we have a better understanding of what it means to actually be something. For example, being Jewish back in the 18th century is very different from being Jewish today because of the historic pressure that Jewish people have felt. This is important to be understood when someone is understanding a label and happens to anti-essentialism exactly because we understand that through history changes ensure. But secondly, there's a lot more listening of one another exactly because we want to see the differences of how each person applies the label. This then is likely to reinforce our sense of community because one, as I already said before, people focus on their similarities, and two, there's decreased scapegoating exactly because one group can't be identified by a set of rigid characteristics, and thus it's far more difficult to blame one group for something. For example, an immigrant isn't going to be a very rigid set of characteristics, and thus it is far more less likely for Trump to be able to say the immigrants are at fault for taking our jobs. This is unimaginably important for two reasons. The first is because of increased support. So even if there still exists oppression under our side of the house, people that are oppressed have this community and support that they're able to rely on for help. But secondly, it is far more likely that people actually do take action because when people are in a community, they feel stronger and thus they feel ready to take down the system that government and opposition want them to take down. For all those reasons,
I thank the member of government for the wonderful speech and happy to call upon the member of opposition. Here.
Well, I have an essential belief that this CA team didn't put this motion for us to talk only about some current discourses, but overall how the society treats you on the basis of how we perceive the human identity and is it essential or not. That is going to be our case, that anti-essentialism gives you a rhetorical tool to alienate other groups for people because they're created from toxic structures and are not just entirely essentially human and have value as there are. Firstly, 2 points on the government bench. Panel, notice that anti-essentialism still has authority institutions and the beliefs that identity is a thing. By the virtue of the Infoslide, insofar we believe that structure form identities, those structure are probably institutions that have authorities, and what they are doing is giving you identity. That is to say, they cannot just say that there will be no identity and no authority structure. Notice that it is probably still hard to exit these structures because you're contingent on the social support that you get from them, you tie your identity to them, and you find them as a valuable part of your life. They have to prove much higher tipping point in which you believe that these safety nets measures are not needed to you. But secondly, notice that for them to fulfill their burden, they need to prove A, that toxic beliefs are unchangeable, something that I will refute in my positive case, and secondly, that they're very stiff. But notice that this is not so. To be a Catholic doesn't mean to be one particular version. There are many different things that you can be as a Catholic. There are many different versions of you as an identity as a female. That is why we have a diversity, and the reason for this is because we inherently understand that there are some traits that are connected to your gender, but some of them are essential to you as an individual being created in its own unique picture. Let's talk about our positive case. Some rebuttal will be integrated. Notice that we, essentially as human beings, believe that we have value. Intuition pump here. We all believe that murder and violence against the human being is wrong. Because of that, every single time when we produce violence or murder, we have to somehow change the definition of the being that we are violating as anti-human. They're toxic in some particular capacity. Their traits are anti-human and they cannot be valued as a human being. Because let's start with the worst example of Hitler that didn't describe Jews as people, but as pests that should be eliminated. Notice how anti-Western behavior sees the West as not like human beings, but unbelievers that deserve to rot in hell because they're differently from the enlightened human beings that should be valued. The only delta there is then that this gives you the rhetorical tools that are much easier to use to ascribe you as unhumane. Listen, I want to be very clear. I understand that there is a trade-off on one side of the house. We have to take time for minorities to prove their humanity. But there is a symmetry there. Because even on their side of the house, if somebody is described as anti-human, they have to prove their humanity to be described in anti-essential way as valuable. The difference then is that on our side of the house, once they prove that they have humanity, it is easier for us to say that their gender, nationality is not the part that makes them wrong or somehow poisoned, but much rather that are traits of their humanity that is valuable. All right. Why then will we have some kind of intervention in all of this and we can change stuff? Notice that the belief that something is essential doesn't equate to you having access to understanding of that essentialism. You constantly rethink the way that your essentialism of gender, religion, and nationality change. You get access to knowledge that perhaps it could function in a different capacity. Perhaps women are more than we previously believed, and we can change that. But secondly, notice that we can always criticize the authorities for getting it wrong. We can criticize Catholic Church, and Catholic Church will change our definition of what is the essentiality of being a Christian. The delta then is only that you cannot blame people for being what they essentially are, because what they essentially are is only the part of their humanity, which I already explained is sacred and should always be valued. Notice that historically this is the progress that we had. We always understood that humanity is valuable. Like from the ancient time, there are rules of the behavior, how we should treat other people. Historically, we only ascribe that humanity to more and more people. Before I continue, is there POI from opening?
If
Closing.
murder is wrong, then I'm pretty sure it is going to be called inhumane in all cultures, which is part of
Yes, but you
anti-essentialism.
can
So your
describe.
impact.
Yeah, understand. Thank you. But you can ascribe who is too permissible to murder on your side in either capacities. Three things that change on our side of the house. Day-to-day behavior. Like intuition pump here. How many times were you called out that your behavior is toxic because you're only following the social norms? How you should not act girly because the girly behavior is something that patriarchy put on you. How you as a gay man shouldn't function in a flamboyant way because that is something that society is putting on you. You cannot achieve your identity insofar as the society doesn't let you because it blames you for your social identity. Secondly, notice how on their side of the house, other people can try to change you and try to avert you. Notice that this is the gay sex example on their side of the house. On their side of the house, conservatives can always say you should go to therapy, you should change yourself, this is not part of you. On our side of the house, you accept gay people as they are. Thirdly, notice how Trump is using exactly this kind of rhetoric. It is not, oh, it is essential to immigrants that they are bad, but they are coming from the country that formed them in a capacity that make them toxic, that make them valiant, drugs and stuff like that. In the moment when they're only a people that essentially are good and their humanity is good, they need to be treated better. Why would we win over our opening? Two things. Firstly, we prove to you logical priority. You need to have social acceptance to enter your identity, because if you don't have social acceptance, you cannot feel as you belong. But secondly, there are other sources of utility outside of your identity, but you cannot access them if your society doesn't give you a safety measure, if your society doesn't accept you. Because of that, we prove to you the magnitude of the impact on the larger scale. So I think that this is pretty clear, CO.
I thank the member of opposition for the wonderful speech and invite the government whip to wrap up the case for government. Hear, hear.
Hi, my name's Alexia. My pronouns are she, her, and I'll be taking POIs verbally. I won't be looking at the chat. Great. The reason why the op bench has the privilege of saying to be Catholic isn't one thing, to be Jewish isn't one thing, that our understanding of being a woman has adapted and we can open it up to more things than just biology, is because in a vastly, for centuries long, essentialist world, there has very recently been an inclination of anti-essentialism. Everything that opposition enjoys about the world and about belonging and about the malleability of identity is a direct result of things changing through time, of things not being malleable, of things not coming from a specific doctrine. And this is why the only debate-winning team is CG, because we explain to you how the narrative of essentialism and anti-essentialism has been operating throughout time and how it's been changing in the last few years and why that is so good. But the first and most important thing that I want to do is really quickly take CO out of the debate, because I really don't think that they kind of know what they're talking about. The first thing that CO tells you is that anti-essentialism also has labels, and they try to muddle the waters by like catching us off guard. This is a little bit uncharitable to say that necessarily we can't argue for a lack of labels in the future, but also a sense of belonging. Rather, what Artemis really beautifully outlined for you is that in a world which is increasingly slowly becoming anti-essentialist, we place less emphasis on labels. This means that we increase what that means, so more people can identify with labels if they want to, but if they won't, it's more likely for them to want to opt out of choosing a label to begin with. And so in the long term, eventually, after we expand meaning and we adapt, and these labels become so malleable to the point where they don't really mean one thing, we're okay in the long term for them to not really be as important. All of the illustrations at the top of Artemis's speech, which is to say in the short term, we're okay with people like using the term woman, but we're also okay in like 20, 30, 40 years from now, I don't know, people not necessarily placing value in that because of anti-essentialism. This is important because it deals with the fact that when Artemis explains to you why labels are so inherently harmful when they're fixed. And CO can't run away from this by saying that, like, oh, it's not that they're totally fixed. Being Catholic isn't just one thing. Because of my intro, right? Because of how we explain to you that they necessarily just by the info slide, but also like by historical like timelines, the fact that people have been so focused on labels and so focused on oppression is because they divide each other based on something fixed. This is why, for the longest time, people were using the Bible or older texts to justify behaviors that now, with time, are most socially acceptable, like women having abortions, like women having sex outside of marriage, or gay people getting married. The reason why we have slowly adapted is because the identity and the label of being a good Catholic person has changed and evolved, and that's literally gov side. That is the difference. The world that opposition loves is one that has been enabled by the slow implementation of anti-essentialism. And we want to expand what it means to be a good Catholic. We want to expand what it means to be a Jew. We want to expand, no thank you, what it means to be gay or queer. And note that the reason why broader labels like queer have been coming up in history is because we're placing less emphasis and less importance on whether or not you're lesbian or bi. It doesn't really matter. And we think that that's the beauty of identity, because the only team that has been able to give you a single practical impact in this round is us. When we tell you that even if we can get one person to feel like they can belong a lot more and they don't have to worry about whether or not they classify as a woman because they haven't transitioned, that is enough to win us the debate, because it is practical, it is real, it is tied to happiness and day-to-day survival. Secondly, CO tries to tell ultimately, having a universal identity is good because otherwise you justify hate. And they bring up Hitler and they tell you verbatim that their harm is that minorities need to prove their humanity under op. Yes, we tell you that this is bad because it's really difficult. Even now, people don't see Jewish people as human because there's a fixed view of what it means to be a Jewish person or of a specific religion, what it means to be a good citizen of your country. We want to expand that. But B, it's also a little condescending for them to be the ones to decide what it means to be of a particular group, for you to want to use old doctrines and old texts and old notions of how you identify. We frankly not up to CO or any other op bench to decide that. Then, before I move on to OG and why really they kind of suck too. Yes, opening.
Freedom in the status quo was because of the fight of groups that act collectively. The only reason why they do that is because they have this universal sentiment that they share an essence between each other.
Okay, great. This is an awesome leeway to go into OGOO, I'm sorry, because the problem with oppression that neither team has been able to identify is that the reason why people feel the need to now go to a label and feel protected is because essentialist structures divided people. So you're not really solving the problem by continuing to have identity as a shield for protection. We are the ones that are telling you that the root of the problem has been essentialist ideas to begin with, i.e., if this was a world where since the beginning of time, we didn't start building notions of race being this particular group of people that looks like this, or religious people being this particular group of people that believes in this text and this thing, then that is when oppression would have been much less likely, because the basis for oppression would have been a lot more nebulous. It would have been a lot more random. We wouldn't be grouping people to this degree. The reason why I feel it's so important to label myself as a woman is because to some degree, I have a relatability to other women who feel less than their male counterparts. This is a direct result of essentialist ideology that has been here through time. And we know that what we're asking you from CG to imagine is a world that is really difficult to grapple, exactly because it's so deeply rooted in society. But we want you to imagine this with us. Essentialism is dangerous because it is how, like, less progressive movements and how people justify oppression, how they actually create identity crisis when the definition of a woman is something fixed that doesn't change. And now I, as someone who might not fit in that traditionally, worry about belonging. I worry that I have to classify as something, and I worry that no one will accept me. We are the side that shows compassion. We are the side that takes off the pressure for you to have to decide who you are and actually let that not be so definitive. Vote CG.
I thank the government whip for their wonderful speech and invite the op whip to wrap up the debate. Here.
Am I visible and audible?
Yes.
Thank you. I'll take my POIs verbally. I'm not looking at the chat. I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. At the top of government whip, we get this information that anti-essentialism is new and a new historical context. In the same breath, they claim that essentialism is the historical problem, and this is why we discriminate it. I think that what happens exclusively with anti-essentialism is the fact that in a situation where we have a fixed identity and we're not happy with a fixed identity, we try to introduce new labels, which led to the problems that CG identifies. The things that we have learned from essentialism, the change that has happened from essentialism. I came out in my 5th grade of elementary school as a bisexual woman. In the meantime, pansexuality became a thing. The same movement that is being the movement that is prescribing us anti-essentialism is the movement that is introducing new labels. These new labels do a couple of problematic things, and this is why on CG's side of the house, you're not going to have this less buying of labels, because there's actively going to be more labels because you want to move from your essentialist identity. Firstly, you get infighting, you get lesbians who discriminate bisexual women because they like men and they shouldn't like men, they should just like pussy. They should just swing onto one side. I think secondly, what you get is this high burden of difference between these two things. I now have to choose between being bisexual and pansexual because these two things are not the same. Well, I could, on the side of essentialism, on our side of the house, fall under the umbrella term of being queer, because queerness, what CG does not understand, is something that is inherent to you. This is why CG cannot co-opt trans women and sexuality, because what they do not understand is that they have to advocate for context. Being a transgender person or having a certain sexuality is not a contextual thing. This is something that is inherent to you as a human being. This is a part of your essence. This means that trans people being included within society and sexualities being more included falls uniquely on our side of the house, because anti-essentialism is going to go against these ideas, because these things are not inherent to you, because anti-essentialism does not care about things inherent to you. I think then secondly, when we're talking about CG, we need to talk about this idea of communities. I've explained why there will be a sort of infighting within these communities, because the more labels you have to introduce to differentiate different identities that you do not deem inherent and essential means that you're going to have more differences between people who do not have to be different.
Point of information.
Not right now. All people who fall under the queer umbrella, which is their essence, should just determine themselves as queer people. They do not have to differentiate labels specifically. CG needs to prove likelihood why in the future we are going to have less labels, especially if this movement is on the rise. If we have the progressive left and the feminist movement and the LGBT movement claiming that you should differentiate yourself and you should have intersectionality and you should explain how these things impact you in a grander scheme. I think that what happens on CEO uniquely is the fact that we're talking about women generally. We're talking about queer people generally. All of these things are still going to be inherent to you, but it is far more easier to empathize with these people and to work with other women because you understand that a trans woman is not inherently different from you. I think this then goes into Patrick's analysis on as to why rhetorics can be used to actively discriminate people in an anti-essentialist world. I think what happens on Gov's side of the house is specifically in the situation where you say that being a trans person is not essential to you, that being a gay person is not essential and inherent to you, you get bad actors who are going to co-opt this and say, oh, these people just want to be special and want to differentiate themselves from the norm. They want attention, they are sexually deviant, and all of the other narratives that we get from conservatives who are pushing against these people. In that specific situation where you have more labels, and I prove why you're going to have more labels, CG does not, why you will have less. In the situation where this is used as a rhetoric mechanism to push out these people, this is going to be more problematic for the minorities. We concede to the trade-off that on our side of the house, when we switch to these narratives, the minorities are going to have to adapt to this. I think that what we uniquely get is in the situation where I'm not seen as a queer, where I'm not seen as a bisexual woman that's dating a man. I'm seen as a queer woman, and this is enough to my inherent identity. I'm seen as just valuable enough. I have my human value, and the human value is inherent to me. We appreciate the value that absolutely every person has, which means that the minorities have a lower burden of proof to show why they should be, why they should be like appreciated as and is seen as normal human beings, right? In this situation, you don't have Trump saying, oh, immigrants are here to take her jobs because they come from a specific country, but he has to co-opt and explain the whole narrative of why that whole specific country is going to be problematic and why the essence and inherent characteristic of these people are problematic. It is not easy to scapegoat and say, oh, but this is just like the general vibes of the people, right? I think in this situation where CG just has a fundamental misunderstanding of what anti-essentialism is, even though they bring clarity to the debate, they cannot win this. Before moving to OG, I'll take opening.
Don't you think that in a world where anti-essentialism was the dominant narrative, people would have found themselves a lot more valuable and have been open to changing their culture because their own agency was protected by
Okay, considering the fact that this house prefers A to B and not this house prefers the world, you cannot fiat that this has happened from the history, like from the first moment in time. We are talking about switching this right now, which means, firstly, that we have all of the historical hindsight that both gov teams talk about. We have all of the things that gov benches say that we've learned from. We understand these things. We actively get better because we understand that discriminating someone based on their skin color was not good in the past. People being slaves because they were black is not good, which means we're actively learning and we're adapting to this. Secondly, we have a better way of calling out institutions for being problematic. I think what OG doesn't understand is that because of our case, because of how easy it is to co-opt rhetorics, it is far more easier in OG's world for the institutions to abuse the power that they have. When you have a police officer that sees a black man, they're going to think all of the bad things that they can think about the black man because they're going to get they get the push of these narratives that are being fed to them from the anti-essentialist norm and movement that is happening. In that situation, it is far more easier for the institutions to abuse this. I think then lastly, what they don't understand from either gov teams is why do we don't have institutions that work well, especially when Patrick explains why this is the case. And secondly, why we don't have morality. Lastly, why we take over opening opposition. Well, I do think that they explain why identity matters. I think that it explains why it's important to a singular person. But we can achieve this, and what is more important is that the entirety of society understands that this is how you ought to treat human beings. This is a clear CO.
I thank the Upwhip for the wonderful speech and all speakers in the round. As you know, results won't be announced until the final ceremony, but do feel free to reach out to us after you learn of the results if you want to know any more. Panel, please join me